Welcome to Deep Thinkers. Tonight, settle in. Let your shoulders drop, let the day go slack, and let me take you somewhere very old and very quiet. We are going to travel back across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, back to a version of Earth that you would not recognize, and we are going to ask a question so large and so strange that it has no comfortable answer. What if complex life had never evolved at all? What if all of this, the trees outside your window, the birds, the fish, the animals, your own body breathing slowly in the dark, what if none of it had ever come to be? It is closer to the truth than you might think, and the story of how close it came is one of the most quietly astonishing stories there is. Here is where it begins. Life appeared on Earth within a few 100 million years of the oceans first forming. The oldest widely accepted traces of living things, the faint chemical fingerprints, and the oldest microfossils date to somewhere around 3.5 to 3.7 billion years ago. Some contested hints push even further back toward 3.8, or even 4.1 billion years. And what that means when you sit with it is remarkable. The planet cooled, the oceans gathered, and almost as soon as there was a stable place for life to take hold, life took hold. It did not wait long at all. On the scale of a planet's lifetime, life arrived early. It arrived eagerly, you could almost say. The hard part, you would think, was getting started, making something living out of nothing living. And life cleared that hurdle quickly. And then it waited. It waited for 3 billion years. Let that number settle over you for a moment, slowly, the way snow settles. 3 billion years, not 300 years, not 3,000, not 3 million. 3 billion years in which life existed, in which the oceans were full of living things and in which almost nothing happened. Single cells, microbial mats, slime and scum, and faint living films spread across the rocks and the shallow seas. That was the whole of it. That was the entire cast of characters on this planet for an interval so long that the human mind cannot really hold it. Unambiguous animals, the first creatures we would recognize as more than a single cell, do not appear in the fossil record until somewhere between 635 and 541 million years ago, which means life spent the overwhelming majority of Earth's habitable history on the order of 3 billion years as nothing more than single cells and the soft mats they built. Picture that as a single long day. If you compressed all of life's history into one 24-hour day, life would appear in the early hours of the morning, perhaps before sunrise. And then for the entire morning, the entire afternoon, the long, slow evening, all the way until just before midnight, there would be nothing but microbes. The animals, the plants, you, everything you have ever loved or seen or touched, all of it would be crammed into the final minutes before midnight. The whole rich pageant of complex life is a thin, bright sliver at the very end of an enormously long and quiet day. And the rest, the vast, patient bulk of it, belonged to the single cell. This is the single most important fact I want you to carry with you into sleep tonight, and I want you to hold it gently the way you would hold something fragile. Simple life was fast. Complexity was the bottleneck. The thing we tend to assume was inevitable, the great rise toward animals and minds and us, was not the easy part of the story. It was the part that very nearly never happened at all. Now, before we descend deeper into this, let me ask you something, and you can answer in your own time, whenever you wake or whenever the morning comes. Tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I am always quietly moved to know how far these stories travel, into what bedrooms, under what skies, in what time zones, while the people who listen drift towards sleep. The comments are there, and I do read them. And if you are new here, and you find that this slow kind of journey helps quiet your mind at the end of the day, you might consider subscribing so that more of these can find their way to you, but there is no hurry. None of this is urgent. We have all the time in the world tonight, and we are going to use it slowly. Because what I want to do over the next long while is walk you carefully into the deep past and lay this mystery out the way you might lay out a map by lamplight. And it really is a mystery, with the three great unanswered questions sitting at the heart of it. Why did it take so long? That is the first. If life was so quick to begin, why did it then idle for billions of years before it became anything more? And the second question, stranger still, was it ever guaranteed? Was complex life always going to happen, written into the rules of the planet from the start, waiting patiently for its moment? Or was it a fluke, a near miss, a thing that came within a hair's breadth of never occurring? And the third question, the one that hums underneath the other two, how close did Earth come to staying a planet of microbes forever? A living world, yes, a green and slimed and breathing world, but a world without a single creature in it, without an eye to see, without a mind to wonder, without you. Nobody knows the full answer to these questions. That is the honest truth, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, but what scientists have pieced together slowly, patiently, over decades of reading the rocks, is a story so rich and so strange that the not knowing only makes it more beautiful. So let us begin to read those rocks together. The first great clue, the first turning of the long, slow gears of this world, has to do with something you are doing right now without thinking about it. Breathing. The air you are drawing in and letting out, slow and even, in the dark. About 1 part in 5 of that air is oxygen. It feels like the most ordinary thing imaginable, the most basic background fact of being alive. And yet for most of Earth's history, that oxygen simply was not there. The early atmosphere had almost none of it. The early air would have killed you in minutes. The world that life first appeared in was a world without breathable air, and the story of how the air filled with oxygen is the story of how the fuse for everything that came later was first lit. It happened because of a particular kind of microbe, one that is still all around us today. We call them cyanobacteria. They are small, simple, single-celled things, but they learn to do something that changed the planet forever. They learn to take sunlight and water and the carbon dioxide drifting in the sea and to use the energy of the sun to build themselves, to grow, to live. Photosynthesis, we call it. And the crucial part, the part that mattered for everything that followed, is what they threw away as waste, because the waste product of this new way of living was oxygen. To the cyanobacteria, oxygen was simply rubbish, an unwanted byproduct, exhaled out into the water and the air the way you might exhale a breath you no longer need. They were not trying to change the world. They were just living the way a thing lives, and quietly, molecule by molecule, breath by breath, they were poisoning the old world and building a new one. For a long time, this oxygen went almost nowhere. The early oceans were full of dissolved iron, and oxygen is a hungry, reactive thing. As fast as the cyanobacteria could produce it, the oxygen would bond with that iron and be locked away, rusting the seas from the inside, settling to the bottom in vast layers. The world drank the oxygen as fast as it was made, the way dry ground drinks the first rain and shows nothing on the surface. But the cyanobacteria kept at it patiently, generation after generation, for an enormous span of time. And eventually the rain came faster than the ground could drink it. Eventually the sinks filled up. The iron in the oceans was used up, bound and buried, and the oxygen had nowhere left to hide. And so for the first time it began to accumulate. It began to gather in the water, and then to seep up into the sky. We call this moment the Great Oxidation Event. It happened roughly 2 4/10 to 2 2/10 billion years ago. And it was, in a real sense, the first deep breath the planet ever took, the first time free oxygen accumulated meaningfully in the atmosphere of the Earth. Now, I want to be careful with you here, because this was not a sudden thing, not a single morning when the sky changed. It unfolded over a very long time, slowly, the way these deep time events always do. But it was real, and it left its mark in the rocks, and we can read that mark today. The way we read it is genuinely lovely, and I want to slow down and tell you how, because it shows you just how cleverly the planet keeps its own diary. Deep in the chemistry of certain rocks, in the way that sulfur is laid down, there is a particular kind of signal. Before there was oxygen in the air, sulfur was processed by sunlight in the upper atmosphere in a strange and distinctive way, leaving a chemical fingerprint behind. Scientists have a name for this fingerprint. They call it the mass-independent fractionation of sulfur. You do not need to hold that phrase. Think of it simply as a particular signature, a watermark pressed into the rock that could only form in a world without oxygen in the sky. As long as the air was oxygen-free, that watermark appears in the rocks age after age after age, and then somewhere around 2.45 to 2.32 billion years ago, the watermark vanishes. It simply stops appearing in the record, and that disappearance is one of the clearest signs we have that oxygen had finally risen, that it had climbed above a certain threshold and thrown an invisible shield across the upper air, ending the old chemistry forever. The rocks remember the exact moment the world began to breathe, so there it is. 2.5 billion years ago, give or take, the fuse was lit. Oxygen had arrived. The planet had taken its first breath. And surely, you would think, this is the moment everything changes. This is the dawn. Oxygen is the fuel that animals run on, the thing that lets a body be large and active and alive in the way we understand life. With oxygen finally in the air, surely the great rise toward complexity could begin. And here is where the story turns strange. Here is where the most quietly devastating fact of all comes in. Because nothing happened. The fuse was lit, and then it stopped burning. After the great oxidation event, oxygen did not keep climbing toward the rich, full air you are breathing tonight. It did not rise and rise until the world was ready for animals. Instead, it rose a little, and then it stalled, it plateaued. The best reconstructions we have place the oxygen of this long middle age of the Earth at somewhere between 0.1% and 10% of the level present in the atmosphere today, and some of the more recent estimates push the low end well below 1%. 1%. Imagine drawing a breath that holds only 1/100th of the oxygen you are used to. That thin, that starved, that faint, and it held there at that low whisper of a level, not for a century, not for 1,000,000 years, but for well over 1,000,000,000 years. I want you to really feel the strangeness of that. The match was struck, the fuse caught, a line of fire began to creep along it, and you can almost lean in toward it, waiting for it to reach the powder, waiting for the world to ignite into something new. And then the fire slowed, and then it stopped, and the little glowing point sat there, motionless, for longer than most of us can even conceive of, going nowhere at all. The planet had taken its first breath, and then it simply held that breath, shallow and unmoving, for 1,000,000,000 years and more. Why? That is the question that hangs over everything that follows, and it is the question we are going to chase, slowly and gently, across the rest of this long night. Why, with oxygen finally in the air, and the door to complexity seemingly cracked open, did the world not walk through? Why did it stall on the threshold for an eternity? There are reasons. There are real, concrete, physical reasons buried in the chemistry of the ancient oceans, and we will get to each of them in turn, slowly, with care, so that you can follow them even as you drift. There is the matter of what the oxygen actually had to do before any animal could live, the ceiling it had to break through and could not. There is the matter of certain nutrients, certain rare and precious elements that the seas were starved of, elements that life needs the way you need food, and without which the great living engine could not rev up. There is the matter of a single, almost unbelievable accident at the level of the cell itself, an accident that may have happened only once in the entire history of the planet, and without which none of this complexity would have been possible, no matter how much oxygen the air held. And there is the strange, alien chemistry of the ocean itself in those ancient days, an ocean that would have been poison to almost everything alive today. We will walk into each of these in its own time. Tonight, there is no rush to reach the end. The end will come when it comes, and you may well be asleep before it does. And that is perfectly all right. That is, in fact, exactly as it should be. You do not need to stay awake to the finish. The story will hold itself together whether you follow it all the way or let go halfway down and sink into rest. Let the deep thoughts carry you only as far as you wish to go, but let me set the shape of what is coming so that even as you drift, some part of you knows where the path is leading. Because this long stall, this billion years and more of a held breath, has a name. Geologists who are not given to drama, who choose their words carefully and soberly, gave this interval a name that tells you exactly how they came to feel about it. They call it the boring billion, sometimes the barren billion, sometimes more gently, Earth's middle age. It runs from roughly 1 8/10 billion years ago to roughly 8/10 of a billion years ago, and it is one of the most remarkable chapters in the whole history of this planet. Remarkable precisely because so little happens in it. No great upheavals, no global ice ages, a world held in an almost eerie stillness, the chemistry of the seas steady, the climate steady, the slow march of evolution nearly frozen in place. A planet on pause, a planet holding its breath. And living within that long stillness, almost lost in it, there was already a kind of cell that carried within it the seed of everything that would one day come. A cell unlike the simple microbes that ruled the seas. A cell with a hidden complexity inside it, a cell that would eventually, in the far distant future, give rise to every plant and every animal and every fungus that has ever lived. To you. These cells already existed during the boring billion. They were already there. But they were rare, they were small, they kept to the margins, low in number, low in diversity, changing slowly if at all, a quiet minority in a world that gave them no room to grow. For more than 1 billion years they waited, holding the potential for everything and going nowhere. Why could they not rise? Why, with the blueprint for complexity already present in the seas, did the world stay simple for so unbearably long? What was holding the line age after age after age, keeping the planet locked in its long microbial stillness? That is where we are going, down into the chemistry of that ancient stalled world, to find the invisible walls that held complexity back. And I think, when you understand what those walls were, and how nearly they held forever, you will feel something close to what I feel when I sit with this story late at night. A kind of vertigo, a kind of awe, the strange, dizzying sense of how close all of this came to never being, how thin the thread was, how much had to go right, by accident, by luck, by the slow grinding of geochemistry across spans of time we can barely name, before a single complex creature could draw a single breath. So stay with me or do not as sleep takes you. Either way, we are going down into the deep past now, into the long, quiet, oxygen-starved middle age of the world, to find out why life waited 3 billion years to become anything more than a single cell. and to ask as gently as such a vast question can be asked whether it ever truly had to happen at all. Breathe slowly. Let the dark be soft around you. And let us go down together into the world that almost stayed forever simple, the world of the long-held breath, the world before the fuse caught fire again. The first thing to understand about that stalled world is what oxygen actually had to do, and why simply being present in the air was not nearly enough. Because oxygen, when it first began to gather, did not float gently into a waiting, empty sky and settle there in neat abundance. It had to fight its way up through a planet that resisted it at every turn. We have already seen how the iron in the oceans drank it down, rusting the seas and locking the oxygen away in vast buried layers. But that was only the beginning of the resistance. There were gases pouring out of volcanoes that hungrily consumed oxygen. There were minerals on the land and in the water that bound it up. The whole planet, in a sense, was a great chemical sponge, and that sponge had to be thoroughly, completely soaked before even a thin film of oxygen could remain free in the air. And soaking a sponge the size of a world is not quick work. It is the slowest work imaginable, carried out one molecule at a time by uncountable generations of microbes across hundreds of millions of years. And here is the cruel arithmetic of it. The microbes producing that oxygen, the cyanobacteria, could only produce as much as their own living allowed, and their living was limited, throttled, held in check by how much they had to eat. Not food the way you think of food, but the raw nutrient elements that any living thing must gather from its surroundings to build more of itself. There were elements in those ancient seas that were desperately scarce, elements that life cannot do without. And as long as they were scarce, the great oxygen-making engine of the cyanobacteria could only idle. It could not roar. It produced enough oxygen over enough time to rust the iron and lift the level to that thin 1%. But it could not produce enough to push past that to fill the air the way the air is filled today. The producers were starved, and a starved engine cannot run fast, and a slow engine could not break through the resistance of a whole reluctant planet. And so the level held, low and steady, for that long, long age. The fuse glowed, but did not advance. Think of it like a bath with the drain left open. You can turn on the tap and water will begin to gather, but if the drain is wide and the tap is weak, the water will only ever rise to a certain shallow level, where the inflow from the tap exactly matches the outflow down the drain. And there it will sit, neither rising nor falling, balanced, stalled, for as long as nothing changes. That is what the oxygen of the boring billion was. A shallow, stalled level, the slow trickle of microbial production exactly balanced against all the hungry chemistry of the world, draining it away. To raise the water, you would need to either open the tap far wider or somehow narrow the drain. And for over 1 billion years neither happened. The bath sat shallow, the world stayed simple, and the creatures that might have become something more, those rare complex cells already hiding in the margins of the sea, they sat in that shallow, oxygen-starved water, unable to rise. Because a large, active, complex body is an expensive thing. It runs hot. It burns through energy at a furious rate compared to a simple microbe drifting quietly in the current. And to burn energy at that rate, you need oxygen, and a great deal of it, far more than that thin 1% could provide. The oxygen was a kind of permission, a permission slip for complexity. And until that slip was granted, until the level rose far past where it had stalled, the door to anything large and active and alive in the way we know life remained firmly, quietly closed. So the question sharpens the way a question does when you turn it over enough times in the dark. It is not merely, why did life take so long? It is, What finally opened the tap? What finally narrowed the drain? What broke a stillness that had held for over 1 billion years and let the bath at last begin to fill? Because something did, eventually. Something cracked the long stasis open. The fuse, after all that waiting, did finally catch again and burn the rest of the way to the powder and ignite the world into all the richness we know. But to understand how it caught, we first have to understand fully and patiently just how completely it had stalled and just how many separate walls were holding the line. There was the wall of oxygen itself, the thin, shallow level that no animal could live within. There was the wall of those scarce nutrients, the starved engine that could not produce more. And there were other walls still, deeper and stranger ones, walls built into the very chemistry of the ancient ocean, walls that may have actively conspired to keep complexity suppressed, to scavenge away the very elements that complex life most needed, to lock the world more tightly into its long sleep the longer that sleep went on. The ancient ocean, it turns out, was not a neutral, empty stage waiting for life to grow more interesting. It was, in a sense, an active jailer. And to understand it, you have to imagine a sea utterly unlike the blue water you might picture when you think of the ocean. A sea layered and strange, and to anything alive today, deadly. But that is a descent for the next stretch of our night, and there is no need to hurry toward it. For now, simply hold the shape of what we have found. Life came early and easily. Complexity came late and hard. Oxygen rose, and then it stalled and held its thin, shallow level for over 1 billion years. And within that stalled and starving world, the seeds of everything we are weighted in the margins, unable to grow. The fuse was lit, and then it stopped burning, and the long, quiet age we call the boring billion settled over the planet like a held breath that would not be released. And the deepest question of all still hangs there in the dark above us, patient, unhurried, waiting for us to come back to it. Whether that breath ever truly had to be released at all. Whether the fuse ever had to catch again, or whether the world might just as easily have stayed exactly as it was, shallow-aired and microbial and quiet, forever, a living planet with no one in it, drifting on through the dark with nothing to know that it was there. We will keep going down slowly into the chemistry that held the line. But let that question rest beside you for now, soft and open, as we move deeper into the long, strange middle age of the Earth. And so we go deeper, down into that long middle age, down into the particular quality of quiet that settled over the planet after oxygen arrived and then refused to go any further. The interval has a name, as we said, the boring billion, and the name is both accurate and, in a way, deceptive. Accurate because the geological record for those 1 billion years, give or take, running from roughly 1.8 billion to 0.8 billion years ago, is almost eerily stable. You can measure stability in many ways when you are reading the rocks. You can look at carbon isotopes, the relative proportions of heavier and lighter carbon atoms locked into ancient limestone, and from those proportions infer how productive the seas were, how much organic material was being buried, how much oxygen was cycling through the system. During the boring billion, that carbon record is notably flat. Not perfectly flat, not absolutely unchanging, but flat in a way that speaks of a system held in place by something, the way a pendulum held at its base doesn't swing. You can look at sulfur isotopes, at iron minerals, at the traces of ancient seawater chemistry preserved in carbonate rocks, and the same story comes back to you. Stability, stasis, a world that had found a kind of balance and was not being knocked out of it. No global glaciations in that entire span. The supercontinent that geologists call Columbia, or sometimes Nuna, had assembled and was slowly beginning its long dissolution, and afterward another great landmass, Rodinia, would take its place. Slowly, quietly, without the drama that would come later. The continents moved as they always do, grinding their vast plates across the mantle, but they did so without triggering any of the great disturbances that precede or accompany the most dramatic chapters in Earth's history. It is worth sitting inside that span of time for a moment. 1 billion years. It is not a duration that the human mind was built to comprehend directly. We are equipped by evolution and experience for timescales of days, seasons, generations, perhaps a few centuries, if we are thinking historically. 1 million years already exceeds ordinary imagination, and 1 billion years is 1,000 times that. The universe itself is only about 13.5 billion years old. Earth is a little over 4.5 billion. The boring billion is therefore not a footnote in Earth's history, but a substantial chapter, roughly a fifth of the planet's entire existence, roughly a 13th of all of cosmic time since the beginning. A planet living through that interval was not pausing between interesting events. It was simply being itself for an almost incomprehensible duration, in a particular mode that was alive and complex in its microbial way, and yet going in the direction of greater complexity almost nowhere. Deceptive, though, because the word boring has a human register that the interval does not quite deserve. It was not boring to the microbes within it, though of course microbes do not experience boredom or anything else in a way we would recognize. It was not boring in the sense of being empty or lifeless. The seas teemed, the bacterial mat spread, the cyanobacteria continued their patient photosynthesis, the ancient chemical cycles of carbon and nitrogen and sulfur kept turning. It was boring in a geologist's sense. It lacked the dramatic excursions, the glaciations, the runaway carbon swings, the mass extinctions and explosions of new form that mark the more turbulent chapters of Earth's biography. It was, in other words, a world that had found a ceiling and was pressing gently against it without breaking through. And to understand what held that ceiling in place, we need first to understand what happened in the brief, strange, almost forgotten chapter that came just before it. A chapter in which the ceiling was nearly breached, in which complexity flickered and came close to something, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, went dark again. This earlier event is called the Lomagundi-Gituli event, and it unfolded roughly between 2.22 and 2.06 billion years ago, which means it arrived in the immediate wake of the Great Oxidation event, when the first surge of oxygen was still fresh in the atmosphere and the world was still adjusting to the radical chemical transformation that cyanobacteria had triggered. The Lomagundi-Gituli shows up in the rock record as a pronounced positive excursion in carbon isotopes, a spike, and a very large one, in the proportion of heavy carbon being buried in ocean sediments. Think of it this way: when organic material, the bodies of microbes, the carbon-rich products of photosynthesis, sinks and is buried in seafloor sediment rather than being oxidized and returned to the atmosphere, it takes the lighter form of carbon with it. The heavier form of carbon is left behind in the water and eventually in carbonate rocks. A large positive excursion in those carbonate rocks means a prolonged, elevated burial of organic material, which in turn implies elevated productivity in the seas, which in turn implies elevated oxygen production. The Lomagundi-Gituli carbon spike is one of the largest such excursions in the entire geological record. It lasted more than 150 million years, and what it tells us is that in the immediate aftermath of the Great Oxidation event, oxygen did not merely arrive and then flatline, it overshot. There was a pulse, a surge, of elevated oxygen that lasted for a geologically significant duration and may have pushed atmospheric concentrations substantially higher than the thin, modest levels that would characterize the boring billion that followed. And during that pulse, something may have happened. In Gabon, in West Central Africa, in rocks dated to approximately 2.1 billion years ago, squarely within the Lomagundi oxygen overshoot, paleontologists discovered what they described as the Francevillian biota, centimeter-scale fossils with organized macroscopic structure, possibly representing colonies or organisms of a complexity well beyond anything a single bacterium could achieve. They are controversial. Their biological interpretation has been debated extensively, and the degree to which they represent genuine multicellular organisms with coordinated cells, as opposed to simpler colonial structures or even non-biological features, is not settled. This is important to say honestly. The Francevillian biota are not a clean, unambiguous chapter of the story, and any telling that presents them as such is exceeding the evidence. But their existence in the rock record during an interval of elevated oxygen in a form that is at least suggestive of organized complexity, that is real. And the timing matters. Oxygen rose early, overshot, and, during that overshoot, something like macro-scale organization appeared in the fossil record. Then the Lomagundi carbon excursion ended, oxygen came back down. The Francevillian organisms, whatever precisely they were, do not continue into the subsequent record in any clear lineage. They appear briefly in a window of opportunity, and then that window closes. What happened to oxygen? The end of the Lomagundi-Getuli event is itself not fully explained. Another honest admission that a story this old is never fully closed. But the leading interpretation involves a kind of negative feedback built into the chemistry of the Earth system. Elevated organic burial means elevated oxygen, which means elevated oxidative weathering of the continents, which means changes in the delivery of nutrients, particularly phosphorus, to the oceans, which means eventual suppression of marine productivity, which means less organic burial, which means oxygen retreats. The Earth system, in other words, had mechanisms to push back against large oxygen excursions, at least at this stage of its history. The overshoot burned itself out, and the world settled into the long, quiet plateau of the boring billion, oxygen thin and stable, the ceiling intact, the possibility of complexity present in some dim chemical sense, but held firmly back from becoming actual. This pattern, the early near miss, the flickering of something that might have been significant, and then the long suppression, is one of the quietly remarkable features of Earth's middle age. The planet was not simply waiting, inert, for the right chemistry to arrive. It tried, in a limited sense. It had at least one episode of elevated oxygen, at least one window that might have permitted greater complexity, and then the window closed and the long stasis resumed. A billion years later, when it finally broke through for good, it would do so through a different set of mechanisms with a different outcome. But knowing that the first surge had come and gone, that the boring billion was not the beginning of the oxygen story, but a kind of long valley between a first peak and the second decisive rise, gives the stasis a particular quality. It is not merely a gap before things got interesting. It is a place where things almost got interesting and then didn't for a very long time. To understand why they didn't, we need to descend into the ocean. And as we do, let the image form gradually, because it is not the ocean of today. The oceanographer Donald Canfield, working in the 1990s and the years that followed, developed a model for the chemistry of the Proterozoic Sea that has become one of the central frameworks for understanding the boring billion, the Canfield Ocean. In this model, the ocean is stratified in a way that has no modern analogue, or rather, the modern ocean has small pockets of something similar in enclosed basins and oxygen minimum zones, but nothing at the global scale that the Proterozoic appears to have maintained. The surface of that ancient sea was oxygenated. Cyanobacteria were active there, photosynthesizing, releasing oxygen into the water as they had been doing for hundreds of millions of years. Sunlight reached the surface. Oxygen built up in the thin, sunlit layer. And that much seems, superficially, Like progress, there was oxygen. Organisms that used it could survive in the upper waters. But go deeper. Drop below the sunlit surface, below the zone where photosynthesis could counteract the chemistry below, and the Canfield Ocean becomes something else entirely. Along the productive margins of continents, the zones where nutrients upwell from deeper water and drive the highest concentrations of microbial life. The deep and intermediate waters were not simply depleted of oxygen. They were, in the model's term, euxinic, rich in hydrogen sulfide, the gas that smells of rotten eggs, produced in vast quantities by sulfate-reducing bacteria living without oxygen in those oxygen-free depths. And below even that, in the anoxic deep basins far from the margins, iron had not yet been swept out of the ocean chemistry. The ancient dissolved iron that the great oxidation event had begun to remove from surface waters still lingered in the cold, dark deep, giving those waters a reddish, mineral-laden chemistry unlike anything in the modern ocean. A glass of water from that sea would be layered poison. From the surface it might look like water, but brought up from depth and allowed to settle, its chemistry would be immediately obvious to any organism designed for modern conditions. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic to most complex life, and in the euxinic middle depths of the Canfield Ocean it was not a trace contaminant, but a dominant chemical player, present at concentrations that would be lethal to most eukaryotic cells. And here is where the ocean becomes not merely an alien environment, but an active suppressor of complexity. The hydrogen sulfide in those deep and intermediate waters was not simply poisonous to swim in, it was, chemically, a scavenger. Sulfide in water reacts readily with metals, pulling them out of solution and depositing them in sediments. And the metals it removed were not incidental trace elements. They were, for the purposes of life, trying to grow more complex, essential. Molybdenum in particular, a metal that most people would be hard-pressed to describe or locate on a periodic table, was present in abundance in the deep ocean of today, dissolved in seawater, available to organisms that need it. But in the euxinic Proterozoic ocean, molybdenum was scarce. Stripped from the water column by reaction with sulfide, locked into seafloor sediments, removed from the chemistry available to living things in the sunlit surface where photosynthesis and growth were occurring. Why does molybdenum matter? Because the enzyme that fixes nitrogen, that takes molecular nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and converts it into the biologically usable forms that organisms need to build proteins and DNA, is called nitrogenase, and nitrogenase depends on molybdenum. Nitrogen fixation is how the ocean replenishes its supply of biologically available nitrogen, and without adequate nitrogen, primary productivity is constrained. Nitrogen limitation is one of the most common things suppressing the growth of phytoplankton in the modern ocean. In the Proterozoic, the molybdenum scarcity imposed by sulfidic deep waters may have imposed a nitrogen limitation on the surface ocean that was chronic, sustained over geological time, and particularly severe for eukaryotic organisms. The complex cells, the ones with nuclei and internal machinery that had higher nutrient demands than their bacterial competitors. Cyanobacteria, the ancient photosynthesizers, were better equipped to tolerate nitrogen scarcity. Some of them fixed their own nitrogen. They had been living in this ocean for hundreds of millions of years and had adapted to its particular chemistry. The eukaryotic algae, the more complex photosynthesizers that would eventually become the base of food chains capable of supporting animals, they were at a disadvantage. Their greater complexity came at a metabolic cost, a higher demand for nutrients, and the Canfield Ocean was in a genuine sense designed by its chemistry to hold them back. This is one of the strangest aspects of the Boring Billion, the possibility that the very existence of complex life in the ocean was being suppressed not by any single dramatic event, not by a catastrophe or a poison flood, but by a quiet, chronic, self-reinforcing chemical equilibrium. The sulfidic deep waters scavenged the metals. The metal scarcity starved the nitrogen fixers. The nitrogen limitation suppressed the complex algae. The suppressed algae meant less oxygen production by complex photosynthesizers. Less oxygen meant the deep waters could remain sulfidic. The cycle held itself in place, not through any intent, of course, and the ocean has no intent, but through the mindless efficiency of geochemistry, which can maintain a particular state for geological ages simply because the feedback sustaining it are stronger than the perturbations trying to break it. The physical record of how different that ocean was lies not only in the chemistry of ancient sediments, but in some of the most dramatic rock formations on Earth. Banded iron formations, the geologists call them BIFs, are layered sedimentary rocks found on every continent in some of the oldest and most ancient terrains the planet preserves. They are typically composed of alternating bands of iron-rich and silica-rich minerals laid down in thin, rhythmic layers that accumulate over vast timescales into formations hundreds of meters thick and extending across enormous areas. They are beautiful in their way, while the banding has a visual rhythm to it, almost hypnotic when you see it in an exposed cliff face or a cut road section, like the rings of a tree but on a geological scale. And they are miniable. Most of the world's iron ore, the iron that eventually becomes steel, that has built cities and railways and ships for the past 2 centuries, comes from banded iron formations that formed in the Precambrian oceans, predominantly before and around the Great Oxidation Event. What were they? They were the product of an ocean saturated with dissolved iron leached from the seafloor by hydrothermal vents, iron that could remain dissolved in oxygen-free deep water, because iron, in the absence of oxygen, stays in a soluble form. When that iron-laden deep water upwelled into oxygenated surface zones, or when oxygen-producing microbes directly contacted it, the iron was oxidized. It became insoluble, precipitated out of the water as iron minerals, and sank to the seafloor. Layer by layer, season by season, the banding was laid down. The episodic alternation between iron-rich and silica-rich layers may reflect seasonal or longer-term cycles in upwelling and productivity, or oscillations in the oxygen levels themselves. The banded iron formations are, in a literal sense, the fossilized chemistry of an alien sea. You can hold a piece of ancient BIF in your hand, and people do hold them, because some of them are used as decorative stone, polished into smooth surfaces where the dark iron bands alternate with red or grey silica in beautiful ribbon patterns. And what you are holding is a physical record of an ocean that had no free oxygen in its depths, that was saturated with dissolved iron, that existed in a chemistry so unlike the modern ocean that it would be lethal to virtually all modern marine life. The iron ore that built the industrial world came from the metabolism of cyanobacteria, from the encounter of biological oxygen with a mineral-laden sea, from the chemistry of a world in transition that existed long before any complex organism had yet drawn breath. There is something almost dizzying in that the steel frameworks of modern cities are, at some remove, biological artifacts of microbes that lived before the boring billion even began. The large-scale deposition of banded iron formations tapered off and largely ended as the Great Oxidation Event progressed and oxygen swept the dissolved iron from the ocean. Their decline is one of the signals geologists use to track the changing redox state of the seas. By the time the boring billion was underway, the great BIF deposits were largely done forming. The iron had been removed, but the ocean had found its new chemistry, the Canfield Ocean, with its sulfidic margins and its trace metal-scavenged depths. And that chemistry proved just as effective, in its own way, at holding back the tide of complexity. And within that ocean, what are the eukaryotes themselves? Where were they during all these hundreds of millions of years of chemical stasis? They were there, That is the thing to hold on to, the complex cell, and the cell with a nucleus, with internal compartments, with the endosymbiotic mitochondrion, already inherited from its bacterial ancestor, was present through the boring billion. This was not an era from which eukaryotes were absent. They existed, they persisted, they did not go extinct. But they were rare and small and showing remarkably little in the way of diversification. The fossil record for this interval is not rich, which is partly a consequence of preservation. Soft-bodied single cells do not fossilize easily, and the record of the Proterozoic is inherently more fragmentary than the record of later eras when animals with hard shells and bones began to leave behind robust traces. But what we do have in the form of organic-walled microfossils called acritarchs, small, often spherical or ellipsoidal structures with distinctive carbon-rich walls, likely the resting stages of early eukaryotic organisms, tells a consistent story. Through much of the boring billion, acritarch diversity is low, turnover is slow. The same basic forms persist for millions and tens of millions of years without the appearance of the new morphologies that would signal a radiation, an adaptive expansion, a lineage exploring new ecological space. Think of it this way. In a healthy, diversifying group of organisms, you expect to see new forms appearing, new shapes, new sizes, new structures that represent different ways of making a living in the environment. The fossil record of such a group shows turnover. Old forms disappear, new forms appear. The suite of types visible at any given time is changing. During the boring billion, the eukaryote fossil record mostly doesn't show this. The same basic forms persist. The lineage is not going extinct, it is present, it is surviving, it is maintaining itself through the fluctuations of an ocean that, despite its stability, was never perfectly unchanging. But it is not radiating, it is not diversifying. It is waiting in a sense, though of course it has no awareness of waiting. It is simply constrained by the ocean's chemistry, by the atmosphere's thin oxygen, by the energetic limits that faced any complex cell trying to grow large and metabolically active in an environment that offered neither enough oxygen to fuel high activity nor enough nitrogen and trace metals to support robust growth. Among the candidate fossils from this interval that researchers have examined as possible evidence of early eukaryotic scale, Grippania spiralis stands out, a coiled, ribbon-like form found in rocks from roughly 1.6 to 1.8 billion years ago, with some potentially older claims contested. It is centimeter scale, which is large by the standards of anything the boring billion offers. Its biological nature is not fully resolved, and it is debated whether Grippania represents a genuine eukaryotic alga, some other form of organized biological structure, or something whose interpretation we have not yet fully worked out. What it illustrates, whatever it truly is something important about this interval. Even the candidates for early largeness, the organisms that seem to gesture towards something more than the single-celled minimum, did not lead anywhere obvious. Grippania, to the extent we can track it, did not seed a radiation of complex forms. It appeared in the record and then recedes from it without clear descendants in the later boring billion layers. It is, in this sense, of a piece with the Francevilian biota of Gabon, another early gesture toward greater size or organization that the chemistry of the world simply did not sustain. There is a pattern here, and it is worth naming clearly because it is easy to miss in a story that ends with animals. The story of the boring billion is not a story of life sitting still, waiting patiently for the right conditions to appear. It is a story of life repeatedly reaching toward complexity and being pushed back. Oxygen spiked early, and something macroscopic appeared in Gabon and then vanished. Eukaryotes were present through the entire boring billion, but stayed small and rare. Grippania reached centimeter scale and left no clear lineage. Each of these is a probe, a tendency toward greater organization, met by a chemistry that could not sustain it. The ceiling held not through any single dramatic mechanism, but through the interplay of atmospheric oxygen, too thin, oceanic nutrients, too scarce, trace metals scavenged by sulfide, energy budgets that could not support the metabolic demands of complexity. And all of those mechanisms reinforced one another in a system that was, from the perspective of any organism trying to grow larger and more complex, relentlessly inhospitable. In a quieter sense, this is what makes the Boring Billion the emotional center of this story. Not the Cambrian explosion, not the great oxidation event, important as both are, but this long middle chapter during which the possibility of complex life was not absent, but was held back, constrained, pressed gently but firmly against the ceiling of what the available chemistry permitted. It would take a series of violent disruptions that belong to the next chapter of this descent, to finally break the stasis. But the stasis itself and the mechanisms that maintained it are the real subject of the question the title asks. Why did it take so long? Because the world, for 1 billion years, had stable and self-reinforcing reasons to stay exactly as it was, and the stasis was not a failure. That is perhaps the last thing to say about the Boring Billion before we turn toward what finally ended it. A living planet covered in microbial mats, threaded through with cyanobacterial filaments. It sees cycling carbon and sulfur and nitrogen through the patient and ancient metabolisms that had evolved over more than 2 billion years. That is not an impoverished world. It is, by any measure other than the human tendency to prize complexity and intelligence, a thriving world. Stromatolites rising from shallow coastal waters, their layered domes the product of millions of individual microbial cells binding and trapping sediment in an architecture that is genuinely communal without any cell having awareness of the community. Bacterial mats spread across the seafloor, turning sunlight and chemistry into biological matter with an efficiency that makes all later forms of life look, in certain respects, extravagant. The chemistry of that world was not broken, it was complete. It was working in the sense that the biosphere was cycling, the oceans were populated, the atmosphere was being maintained in a state far from the dead equilibrium a lifeless planet would reach. Life was there, thoroughly and pervasively there, filling every niche that the available chemistry permitted. If the Lomagundi overshoot had not burned itself out, if the Francevillian window had stayed open a little longer, if the Canfield Ocean had somehow tipped into a different chemical state 1 billion years earlier than it did. If the phosphorus supply to the ancient seas had been a little less restricted by whatever combination of tectonic and weathering conditions kept it scarce, any of these changes might have brought the second oxygenation sooner, and with it the conditions that animals require. Or they might not. The chain of contingencies is long, and pulling on any one link risks changing all the others in ways that are not easy to trace. The Boring Billion might have ended at 1.5 billion years ago, or it might have continued until the planet itself became uninhabitable as the sun slowly brightened and the carbon dioxide cycle failed. These are the edges of what we know, the places where the solid rock of evidence gives way to the softer ground of inference and the even softer ground of speculation. And it is right, at this depth in the night, to feel the ground change beneath us, to notice that we are no longer walking on the firmly documented and are beginning to move into the territory of the almost, the might have been, the contingent. The ocean was a jailer. That is what we said at the close of our last movement, and now you know more precisely what that means. The Canfield Ocean, with its sulfidic margins and its scavenged trace metals, was not caging life in any intentional sense, but was doing something functionally similar, maintaining conditions in which the complex and the demanding, the eukaryotes, the algae, the organisms that required more of everything, could not thrive while the simple and the ancient, the bacteria, the archaea, the organisms that had spent 2 billion years perfecting their metabolic economies, persisted and flourished. The jailer was geochemistry. The lock was made of molybdenum and phosphorus and hydrogen sulfide. The walls were built of thin oxygen and flat carbon, and the quiet recycling of an ocean that had reached its own kind of equilibrium. And in the next stretch of our descent, we will turn to the key that eventually opened the lock, not gently, not quietly, but through some of the most violent episodes in Earth's history. Ice ages so severe the planet froze nearly to its own equator, thaws so abrupt the chemistry of the ocean changed within geologically brief moments, a pulse of nutrients so large it altered the very base of the food web. The boring billion ended in the end, not by slow drift, but by shock. And in the aftermath of that shock, in the waters that warmed again after the longest and hardest freezes Earth has ever known, something finally arrived that had been waiting, patient and contingent, for over 1 billion years. But the cold comes later. For now, let the boring billion hold you. Let its strange, settled quality settle something in you as well. A world that lived for 1 billion years in equilibrium, reaching gently toward complexity and being held back, alive in every sense that mattered to the organisms within it, full of chemistry and motion and the patient work of ancient metabolisms. That is a real world, not an absence. And the fact that we are here on the other side of the disruptions that ended it is not the world's culmination or its purpose. It is simply what happened next. And so we arrive at the question that sits at the heart of everything we have been circling. Not the ocean's chemistry, not the atmosphere's slow thickening with oxygen, not the 1 billion years of stillness in the rock record, but the cell itself. The machinery inside the cell. The accident, if it was an accident, that made everything else possible. Think of what a prokaryotic cell is at its simplest, a membrane enclosing a space, genetic material floating loose inside, no nucleus to contain it, ribosomes for assembling proteins, enzymes for capturing energy and running chemistry. It is a remarkable thing, and you do not misunderstand, something that can survive in boiling springs and frozen salt water and the airless interior of ancient rock. Bacteria have been running essentially the same basic architecture for over 3 billion years, and they are extraordinarily good at it. They are, by any measure of persistence and planetary influence, the most successful organisms Earth has ever produced. They made the oxygen that sits in your lungs tonight. They hold the nitrogen cycle together. They will outlast every animal that has ever lived. But they are also, in a deep and specific sense, capped. There is a ceiling above the prokaryotic cell, not a ceiling anyone placed deliberately, but one that emerges from the physics of how energy moves through small membranes, from the geometry of DNA floating free in cytoplasm, from the simple arithmetic of how much power a cell can generate and how much a more complex genome costs to copy and maintain. Bacteria are efficient. They are also, in a sense, permanently lean. The complexity that eventually produced eyes and brains and the slow breathing of a sleeping body tonight. That complexity was, for most of Earth's history, not just absent, but energetically unaffordable, not forbidden, simply out of reach. And then something happened, something so singular, so improbable in the eyes of many biologists that it may have occurred only once in 4 billion years of life on this planet. Once. And we are here because of it. The event is called endosymbiosis. The word means, roughly, living together on the inside, and what it describes is a merger, an ancient, irreversible joining of two different kinds of cell into something that had never existed before. At some point in the Proterozoic, the exact moment still uncertain, The boundary between some two cells dissolved in a way that did not end in one consuming the other and moving on. Instead, the consumed cell stayed. It kept its own membrane. It kept its own remnant genome. It became, over deep time and countless generations, a permanent resident inside the larger cell. An organelle, a structure with a function, a tiny engine humming away in the interior of something bigger than itself. That engine is the mitochondrion, and the cell it eventually came to power was the eukaryotic cell. The kind of cell you are made of, the kind every plant and every animal and every fungus on this planet is made of. The mitochondrion, in its distant ancestral form, was almost certainly a free-living alpha proteobacterium. A bacterium in the group that today includes organisms such as Rhizobium and Rickettsia, recognizable members of a known mapped branch of the bacterial family tree. This ancestral bacterium was engulfed by, or merged with, an archaeal host cell, a cell from Archaea, the third great domain of life, a lineage as ancient and distinct from bacteria as bacteria are from the cells they would eventually help create. The details of exactly how this merger happened, whether it was a predatory engulfment or a more gradual intimacy, are still debated. But the outcome is not. The outcome is written in the biology of every eukaryotic cell alive today. Look closely at a mitochondrion, and you still see the ghost of the free-living bacterium it once was. It has its own DNA separate from the nucleus. It replicates by dividing the way bacteria divide, not the way the rest of the cell divides. Its inner membrane, the membrane across which it pulls the electrons and protons that generate the cell's energy, is folded in a way that echoes the membranes of certain modern bacteria. It is, in a very real sense, a bacterium that never left. A bacterium that struck a deal with its host cell so profound that neither ever became independent again, and the partnership became the engine of all subsequent complexity. The same logic applies, separately and later, to the chloroplast, the green organelle inside plant cells and algal cells that performs photosynthesis. The chloroplast descends from an engulfed cyanobacterium, from the very lineage of organisms that produced the oxygen in Earth's first great oxygenation event. That cyanobacterium, too, was taken in and never released, and over time it gave up most of its independent genome to the host cell's nucleus and became a dedicated solar panel inside the cell, capturing light and converting it to chemical energy. Two mergers, two ancient accidents, and every tree and blade of grass and fragment of seaweed in the ocean is their descendant. What is striking, what is, depending on your perspective, either deeply reassuring or quietly vertiginous, is that neither of these mergers appears to have happened twice. There is no second independent origin of the mitochondrion anywhere in the tree of life. There is no alternate lineage of complex eukaryotic cells that arrived at the same solution through a different route. Every eukaryote on Earth, every one of the millions of species of animals and plants and fungi and protists and algae, traces back to one ancestral merger. One. In over 3 billion years of life running constantly, evolving ceaselessly, experimenting with every available chemical trick, the fusion that produced the complex cell appears to have happened exactly once. Think of that for a moment. Let it settle. In the history of every living thing on this planet, the single most consequential step toward complexity, the step that made everything else possible, from the first worm to the first vertebrate to the first sleeping mind, occurred once in some unnamed ancient ocean between two cells whose identities we have only partly reconstructed. And if it had not occurred, if the archaeal host had simply digested its bacterial guest, or if the bacterium had gone on living its independent life, or if the moment of merger had simply never come, it is entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that nothing more complex than a microbial mat would ever have emerged on this planet. But why does the merger matter so much? Why is a cell with a mitochondrion fundamentally different in terms of what it can build and become from a cell without one? The answer comes largely from the work of two researchers, Nick Lane and William Martin, who developed what is sometimes called the energy per gene hypothesis. The core of their argument is elegant and somewhat startling when you first encounter it. Bacteria are energy limited in a specific way. To generate energy, they use their outer membrane, passing electrons and protons across it to drive the molecular motors that produce ATP, the chemical currency cells spend on everything they do. But the outer membrane of a bacterium is a fixed and limited surface. As a bacterium grows larger, its volume increases faster than its surface area. It hits a wall. There is only so much membrane, only so many energy-generating sites, only so much power available. And so bacteria stay small, not because evolution never tried to make them larger, but because the physics of membrane-to-volume ratios punishes any attempt to grow significantly. The prokaryotic cell is locked into small size and the relatively simple genomes that small, energy-constrained cells can afford to run. The mitochondrion breaks this constraint in a precise and powerful way. Inside the eukaryotic cell, the mitochondrion has its own internal membranes. The folded inner membranes, like a city of tiny power generators packed inside the cell. The total surface area available for energy generation is no longer the single outer membrane of one small cell. It is the combined inner membranes of dozens or hundreds of mitochondria living inside a much larger cell. The energy available to a eukaryotic cell per unit of genome is orders of magnitude larger than what a bacterium of the same size could generate. The ceiling has been lifted dramatically. The eukaryotic cell can afford a larger, more elaborate genome. It can afford the protein production machinery to run a more complex body plan. It can afford the regulatory networks, the genetic switches that turn on and off in response to chemical signals, that govern when a cell becomes a muscle cell and when it becomes a neuron, that are simply too expensive for a bacterium to run. The energy per gene argument says, in essence, that complexity was not merely chemically or evolutionarily prohibited before eukaryotes. It was unaffordable. It was not on the menu. And the mitochondrial merger was not just one way of becoming complex. It may have been the only way, given the physical constraints of membrane-based energy generation. Lane and Martin's framework has been debated and refined, as all productive scientific ideas are. There are researchers who argue the energetic advantages have been overstated, or who point to complex-seeming prokaryotes that push against the simple narrative. Biology is never without its complications, but the broad insight that the energy economy of the prokaryotic cell is a genuine ceiling and that the mitochondrial merger is what broke it is now widely accepted as a major part of the story of why complexity took so long to arrive. And it deepens the contingency in a sobering way, because if the mitochondrial merger happened once, and if it was the prerequisite for the kind of energetic capacity that complex life requires, then the entire trajectory from microbial world to animal worlds, from the silent ocean of bacterial mats to the first creature that could see and move and eventually think, depended on a single event. A single encounter between two cells in an ocean that had been running for 1 billion years without producing it. An event that, for all we know, might not occur once in the lifetime of a typical planet orbiting a typical star. Let that sit alongside the oxygen story. Let it sit alongside the phosphorus and the molybdenum and the sulfidic ocean. Because the cellular accident and the environmental constraints were not separate problems to be solved separately. They were simultaneous locks on the same door. Eukaryotes, the descendants of that first ancient merger, existed during the Boring Billion. They were there. The fossil record and the chemical traces in ancient rocks tell us that cells with nuclei and mitochondria had come into being by at least 1.8 billion years ago and possibly earlier. Gripaenia spiralis, the coiled ribbon-like fossil found in rocks dating to roughly 1.6 to 1, 8 billion years ago, may represent an early eukaryotic experiment, a genuinely large organism by the standards of its age, visible to the naked eye, made of cells with the new eukaryotic architecture. What it actually was remains uncertain, its biological affinity still debated among paleontologists. But it points towards something real. The eukaryotic body plan was available early, and it tried to do something with itself, and it failed to spark anything lasting. The acritarchs, the organic-walled microfossils that serve as the primary record of eukaryotic diversity through the Proterozoic, show low diversity and slow turnover through much of the boring billion. Whatever advantage the eukaryotic cell possessed in terms of its energetic potential, that potential was not translating into ecological dominance or evolutionary radiation. The seas were still ruled by bacteria. The base of the food web was still microbial, and the reason, increasingly, seems to point back to the environment, to the second lock on the door, the one that the cellular merger alone could not open: phosphorus. It is worth pausing on this word, on this element, because it does not carry the dramatic charge of oxygen or the apocalyptic imagery of a frozen planet. Phosphorus is, in common experience, something found in fertilizer bags and fire safety systems and the faint glow of old luminescent watch hands. But in the chemistry of life on geological timescales, phosphorus is the closest thing to a master switch that the biosphere has. It is a component of DNA and RNA and ATP, the last of these being the energy currency that the mitochondria produce. It is the backbone of the genetic molecule and the coin of cellular energy simultaneously. And it is, crucially, a finite resource in any given ocean at any given time. Life needs phosphorus to grow. Algae and bacteria near the ocean's surface take it up and incorporate it into their bodies. When they die, they sink. Their bodies fall through the water column, and much of the phosphorus in them is eventually buried in sediment on the seafloor, locked away from the biological economy of the surface waters where sunlight drives photosynthesis. The phosphorus that remains in the surface ocean, recycled by the slow chemistry of upwelling waters and weathering rock delivered from the continents, sets the ceiling on how much life the ocean can support. More phosphorus means more algae and more bacteria at the surface, more photosynthesis, more oxygen produced. Less phosphorus means less of all of it. During the boring billion, the evidence increasingly suggests that marine phosphorus was chronically low, not absent, as the ocean was biologically productive and full of microbial life, but suppressed, held at levels that constrained how much oxygen the biosphere could generate. And there is a circularity here, a self-reinforcing loop, that helped lock the system in place. Low oxygen meant sulfidic conditions in much of the deeper ocean, as we have already explored in the chemistry of the Canfield Ocean. And sulfidic conditions, as it turns out, are hostile to phosphorus cycling. In anoxic and sulfidic sediments, the geochemical pathways that normally release phosphorus back into the water column are altered, tending to trap phosphorus in solid form rather than returning it to the water. The ocean was, in a sense, hoarding its phosphorus in its sediments, making it unavailable to the surface life that needed it to grow and produce oxygen. The system fed on itself. Sulfidic conditions suppressed phosphorus availability. Low phosphorus suppressed productivity and oxygen production. Low oxygen maintained the sulfidic conditions. The ocean was not broken, it was stable. It had found an equilibrium, and that equilibrium was the chemistry of the boring billion, self-maintaining and resistant to change. And then there is molybdenum, a trace metal present in the ocean in vanishingly small concentrations compared to something like iron or magnesium, but essential to certain enzymes in a way that makes it quietly indispensable to the functioning of the nitrogen cycle. The most important of these enzymes is nitrogenase, the protein complex responsible for nitrogen fixation, the process by which certain microbes convert molecular nitrogen gas, which is abundant and essentially inert, into forms of nitrogen that living things can actually use: ammonia, nitrate, the nitrogen that eventually finds its way into amino acids and proteins and nucleic acids. Without nitrogen fixation, the biological nitrogen cycle would slowly drain. Life on Earth depends, at its foundation, on organisms that can perform this alchemical trick of pulling nitrogen from the air and making it biological. And nitrogenase, the enzyme that does this, is a molybdenum-bearing protein. It has molybdenum at its active site at the chemical heart of its function. In the sulfidic Canfield Ocean, molybdenum was scarce at the seafloor and in the deep anoxic and euxinic waters. Hydrogen sulfide in the water column forms insoluble compounds with molybdenum and pulls it out of solution, depositing it in sediments rather than keeping it available in the water. This scarcity propagated upward through the food web. Nitrogen fixers, the cyanobacteria and other microbes responsible for keeping the nitrogen cycle running, were starved of the metal their key enzyme required, and nitrogen limitation that results from impaired nitrogen fixation falls most heavily not on the bacteria that can fix nitrogen themselves, but on organisms that cannot, including the eukaryotic algae, the complex photosynthesizers that the world would eventually need to produce the next great pulse of oxygen. A world where molybdenum is locked away in the sediments of a sulfidic ocean is a world where the nitrogen supply for eukaryotic algae is suppressed, and suppressed algae cannot drive the oxygen cycle upward. And without rising oxygen, the sulfidic conditions persist, and the molybdenum stays locked away. Another loop, another self-closing trap. This is what the environmental bottleneck of the boring billion looks like when you examine it closely. It is not one lock, but several, and they key into each other. Phosphorus starves the surface ocean of productivity. Sulfidic conditions trap molybdenum and starve nitrogen fixers of their essential metal. Low oxygen and abundant hydrogen sulfide scavenge other trace metals as well: iron, zinc, nickel, each of which plays a role in some critical enzyme somewhere in the web of biochemistry that complex life requires. The ocean of the boring billion was not simply oxygen poor, it was trace metal poor, nitrogen limited, phosphorus limited, chemically hostile to the eukaryotic algae that could have driven the oxygen cycle out of its stable plateau. And the continents during much of this interval were not helping. The supercontinent cycle, the slow waltz of Earth's tectonic plates as they assemble into a single vast landmass and then break apart and drift and reassemble again, plays a role in nutrient delivery to the ocean that is easy to overlook. When continents break apart, the rifting margins produce volcanics and expose fresh rock to weathering. Rivers carry the products of that weathering, silica, phosphorus, trace metals, into the sea. Tectonic disruption is, in a sense, a geochemical pump that fertilizes the ocean. During the boring billion, the supercontinent Columbia, also called Nuna, was assembling and then persisting in a state of relative stability. It was followed, in the later part of the boring billion, by the supercontinent Rodinia, which similarly sat in a tectonically quiet configuration for much of its existence. Stable supercontinents mean reduced rifting, reduced exposure of fresh rock, reduced delivery of nutrients to the coastal seas. The weathering pump ran slow. The phosphorus pulse that comes with the breakup of a continent and the opening of new ocean basins was muted. The planet's geochemistry was, in this sense, conspiring toward stasis from multiple directions simultaneously. The tectonic configuration reduced the nutrient input that might have broken the low oxygen equilibrium. The ocean chemistry that resulted from low oxygen then suppressed the trace metals and nitrogen that complex life needed. and the energetic constraints of the prokaryotic cell set an additional ceiling below all of it. It was a system designed by no one and directed by no one, but functioning with extraordinary effectiveness as a barrier to the complexity that eventually emerged. Now, there is something important to hold alongside all of this, because when we speak of the boring billion as a bottleneck, as a period of stasis and suppressed complexity, we risk making it sound like a failure, like the planet was trying to become complex and was being prevented. But that framing imposes a narrative on deep time that the deep time itself did not contain. The bacteria of the boring billion were not frustrated. The eukaryotes drifting through the low phosphorus seas as a quiet minority were not waiting. There was no teleology in the chemistry of the Canfield Ocean, no intention in the slow, tectonic settling of the supercontinents. The world was simply what it was, full of life, complex chemistry, metabolic diversity, and ecological relationships we are only beginning to understand. The strangeness of the boring billion is something we project onto it from the vantage point of our own complexity. We look back at 1 billion years of apparent stasis and feel the weight of it, the improbability of all that time passing without producing anything recognizable to our animal eyes. But to a microbe in the Proterozoic sea, working its molecular chemistry and dividing and exchanging genes and adapting to the slow shifts in salinity and temperature and nutrient availability, there was no stasis. There was only the world as it was. It is us, the complex, eukaryotic, oxygen-dependent, mitochondria-powered minds lying in the dark tonight, who look back at that world and see it as almost, as very nearly, as a planet that came breathtakingly close to remaining simple forever. And here is perhaps the deepest thing about the cellular bottleneck, the thing that makes the endosymbiotic merger feel most like a hinge in the history of life rather than just another step in a long chain of events. It is that multicellularity itself, the act of cells sticking together and beginning to cooperate, dividing labor among themselves, becoming tissues and eventually organs, and eventually bodies, is not particularly rare or difficult. Multicellularity evolved independently over and over in the history of life. In algae, in fungi, in animals, in plants, in slime molds, in various bacterial lineages. Simple multicellularity, the kind where cells just adhere to each other and perhaps share nutrients through connections between them, appears to be something that evolution finds relatively easy to do. Given cells and time and the right selective pressures, they will stick together. The step is repeatable. What is not repeatable, or at least has not repeated in 4 billion years, is the eukaryotic cell itself. The complex internal architecture, the nucleus, the mitochondria. The elaborate protein-importing machinery that moves the products of the mitochondrion's remnant genome between its own interior and the cytoplasm. The endomembrane system, the cytoskeleton. All of these features, taken together, constitute a cell of extraordinary complexity compared to a prokaryote, and they all trace back to the one merger. The hard step was not sticking cells together. The hard step was building a cell that could, when eventually stacked with other cells of its kind, generate the genomic and energetic and regulatory richness needed for a true division of labor. A liver cell that is fundamentally different from a nerve cell, a muscle cell, that does something a skin cell cannot, a cell that can afford the metabolic cost of making an eye. Simple multicellularity is easy. Complex multicellularity, the kind that produces organisms with differentiated tissues and coordinated development and real bodies, requires the eukaryotic cell as its foundation, and the eukaryotic cell required the merger, and the merger may have happened once. So there are two distinct bottlenecks. This is important to keep clear because it means there were two distinct ways in which the long microbial dominance of this planet could have persisted indefinitely, two distinct points at which the contingency was absolute and the chain of events could have simply not continued. The first is cellular. The endosymbiotic merger that produced the eukaryotic cell is, on current evidence, a singular event. There is no known second eukaryogenesis, no alternate branch of complex cell-bearing life that arrived independently. If that merger had not occurred, if the one ancestral encounter between the archaeal host and the alpha proteobacterial symbiont had simply not produced a stable partnership, then the energetic ceiling on prokaryotic complexity would have remained intact. The world would have continued its microbial existence indefinitely, diverse and chemically rich and biologically productive, but permanently simple by the standards of what eventually appeared. The second bottleneck is environmental. Even with the eukaryotic cell in existence, as it was throughout the boring billion, the geochemical conditions of the Proterozoic ocean suppressed the ability of complex life to expand and dominate. Low phosphorus, low molybdenum, low trace metals, sulfidic deep waters, a tectonic configuration that reduced nutrient delivery. All of these conspired to keep eukaryotes rare and marginal. The cellular potential was there, in the form of that first ancient merger and its descendants. But the environment had not yet opened the door wide enough for that potential to express itself at scale. You needed both locks to open, not just the cell, not just the environment, both. And the cell had to come first, because without it there was nothing for the environmental window to admit when it eventually cracked open. And the environment had to eventually change, because the cell alone, drifting in a sulfide-choked, nutrient-poor ocean, could not force its own liberation. Lying here in the dark, the body slowing, the mind beginning its long drift towards sleep, consider what this means for the question the title of this night's journey poses. What if complex life had never evolved at all? What would have to have gone differently? Almost anything. That is the honest answer. The cellular merger, happening as it did, perhaps once in the history of two cells that would otherwise never have produced anything more than further bacteria and archaea, could have simply not happened. The alpha proteobacterium and its host could have separated. The partnership could have remained unstable and dissolved before it became heritable. The ancestral eukaryote could have arisen and then been outcompeted into extinction during the long, harsh intervals of the boring billion, before the environmental conditions that would let it radiate had arrived. Or the cellular merger could have happened and the environment could have held. The supercontinents could have remained assembled. The phosphorus could have stayed locked in the sediments. The Canfield Ocean's sulfidic margins could have persisted for another billion years, trapping molybdenum and starving the nitrogen cycle and keeping the oxygen ceiling where it sat. The eukaryotic cell would have continued to exist, a rare, small, low-diversity minority in the microbial world, and gone nowhere. Or the environment could have eventually changed, and the cellular merger might never have produced what it produced if the merger itself had been subtly different, if the ancestral alpha proteobacterium had carried different metabolic machinery, if the archaeal host had been a different kind of archaeon, if the early eukaryotic cell had not retained the mitochondrial genome in the particular way it did, retaining just enough genetic material inside the mitochondrion to regulate energy production locally, a feature Lane and Martin argue is essential to making the energetic system work as well as it does. The contingency runs deep. It runs through the chemistry of one ancient cell meeting another, and through the geochemistry of a planet deciding, over hundreds of millions of years, how to distribute its phosphorus and molybdenum and oxygen, and through the slow grinding of tectonic plates that either delivered or withheld the nutrients that could have broken the equilibrium earlier or later, or perhaps not at all. And the multicellularity point gives the contingency one more layer, because multicellularity, we said, is easy. It has evolved many times. but it evolved many times on a planet that had already produced the eukaryotic cell. What simple multicellularity looks like in a world that never had the eukaryotic merger is not what we know. Bacteria form biofilms, communities of cells embedded in a shared matrix, coordinating their chemistry, sometimes differentiating into functional subtypes. Some cyanobacterial filaments show a genuine simple division of labor between cells that photosynthesize and cells that fix nitrogen. These are real steps toward multicellular organization, and they are impressive, and they have been doing this for billions of years, but they have not produced eyes, they have not produced brains, they have not produced the kind of complex, differentiated body that requires a eukaryotic cell's energetic capacity and genomic richness and regulatory depth. In a world without the endosymbiotic merger, multicellularity would still probably have evolved. It would have been bacterial multicellularity. It might have been quite elaborate by prokaryotic standards. But the ceiling that the prokaryotic energetic constraint places on genomic complexity, and therefore on the complexity of what bodies built from such cells could ever achieve, would have remained. And the planet would have been a world of sophisticated microbial communities, mats and biofilms and stromatolites and filamentous colonies performing their ancient metabolic routines forever. Not dead, not barren, not even, by some measures, simple, but permanently, geochemically, thermodynamically capped below the threshold of what we mean when we say complex life. The world you are drifting off inside tonight, the oxygen you are breathing, the body you are lying in, the mind that is softening at its edges now as the dark settles. All of it traces back through the Cambrian animals and the Ediacaran experiments and the snowball thaws and the second oxygenation and the rise of the algae and the long patience of the boring billion, all the way to that one ancient merger in an ancient sea. And the merger traces back to two cells whose names we do not know in an ocean we would not recognize on a planet that had been running its microbial experiment for over 1 billion years without producing anything like what they eventually became. The environmental bottlenecks did not go away by themselves. The tectonic configuration that suppressed nutrient delivery, the self-reinforcing chemistry of low oxygen and sulfidic water and locked away trace metals. None of this dissolved gradually or politely. The door did not drift open, it was blown open in the end by events so extreme that they briefly altered the planet's entire surface environment. But that story, the cold that came and the thaw that followed, and what emerged from the warming waters when the ice was gone, that is for the next part of the descent. The night is long and patient, and so is the story it contains. For now, let the cellular bottleneck sit with you. Let the image of two ancient cells, a merger that happened once, an energetic revolution contained inside a membrane, smaller than any structure you have ever seen. Let that sit alongside the image of the boring billion stillness, the flat ocean and the stable carbon, and the patient bacteria going about their ancient work. Both are real, both are part of the same long pause before the world became capable of producing anything that could notice the world. And the noticing, the quiet awareness, lying in the dark tonight, feeling the weight of deep time pressing gently on the edges of consciousness, is the far end of a chain that very nearly had no far end at all. The tectonic plates will shift again in our story. The ice will come. The chemistry of the ocean will at last be broken open. But for this moment, rest in the middle of the chain, in the space between the merger that made everything possible and the environment that took another 1 billion years to let it through. That space is enormous. It held the whole world, and it held it still. And in its stillness, it is as close to forever as anything in Earth's history ever came. Let the deep thoughts settle and let yourself sink with them. And so the pause ends. Not gently, not with a quiet rising of the tide or a slow brightening of some ancient dawn. The pause that had held the world in stillness for over 1 billion years did not conclude the way a long sleep concludes, with a gradual return to wakefulness and the soft reordering of the senses. It ended the way a dam ends, suddenly catastrophically, with an accumulation of pressure that the structure could no longer contain. It ended in ice. To understand what happened to the world around 800 million years ago, you have to hold two thoughts at once, and they will feel like contradictions at first. The first thought is that the planet was about to grow colder than it had ever been in the long history that the dossier of rocks and isotopes and ancient chemistry has allowed us to read. Colder than any winter that any organism living today has ever experienced. Colder than the poles in the depth of their darkness. Cold beyond any frame of reference a warm body can intuitively reach for. And the second thought is that this cold, this catastrophic, planet-wide, near-annihilating cold, was the thing that finally broke open the long silence and made complex life possible. The boring billion, as we have been calling it, that named and real interval from roughly 1.8 to 0.8 billion years ago, had been defined by stability. The supercontinents sat and the carbon isotopes were flat, and the oceans were sulfidic in the middle depths and iron-rich below, and the eukaryotic cells existed in the margins of a world that remained, in every measurable way, a world built for and ruled by bacteria. The oxygen had risen once at the Great Oxidation Event around 2.4 to 2 billion years ago, and then it had stalled, sitting at perhaps 1% or less of the levels you are breathing now, low enough that any thought of large, active, metabolically hungry animal life was a chemical impossibility. The energy per gene ceiling imposed by simple prokaryotic architecture had been cracked only once in the singular merger of the archaeal host and the alpha proteobacterium that became the mitochondrion. But the cracking of that cellular ceiling had not been enough, because the environment surrounding those new eukaryotic cells had continued to withhold the permissions they needed to do anything extraordinary. The phosphorus was scarce. The molybdenum was locked away in sulfide minerals at the ocean margins. The nitrogen-fixing enzymes that might have fed a new era of eukaryotic algae were starved of the trace metals they required to operate. And the whole vast system had hummed along in its ancient, patient, microbial rhythm, almost as if the planet had decided that bacteria were sufficient. But sufficiency, it turns out, is not the same as permanence. Around 800 million years ago, the first signs appeared that something in the long stability was shifting. The mechanisms behind what happened next are still being pieced together, and the scientists who study these deep time transitions are careful to say that the causal chains are complex and not fully resolved. But what the rock record shows with considerable clarity is that beginning somewhere around this time, the balance of the Proterozoic ocean began to tip. The eukaryotic algae, those cells that had carried the mitochondria, and with them the energetic capacity for more elaborate biochemistry, began for the first time to take hold in the sunlit upper layers of the sea in a meaningful way. What the organic biomarkers tell us, the steranes, the fossil molecules derived from the sterols that only eukaryotes produce, the chemical fingerprints preserved in ancient sediments, is that something shifted in the makeup of the communities doing photosynthesis in the surface ocean, somewhere in the interval from roughly 800 to 650 million years ago. Bacteria had dominated primary production for billions of years. The ancient seas had been fed and oxygenated and chemically shaped almost entirely by cyanobacteria, those same organisms that had first generated free oxygen at the Great Oxidation Event, that had been among the most successful life forms in the history of the planet. And that had done so well at their work that in some sense they had made the world too stable, too chemically locked for anything more complex to displace them. And now, slowly, that dominance was beginning to erode. Not because cyanobacteria had failed at anything, but because the eukaryotic algae carrying the energetic revolution of the mitochondrion began to find enough of what they needed, enough phosphorus, enough trace metals, enough dissolved oxygen in the surface waters, to begin outcompeting bacterial primary producers in certain niches. And this mattered enormously in a way that goes beyond the mere composition of the plankton community, because eukaryotic algae are bigger than cyanobacteria. Their cells are larger, their organic content is richer, and when they die and sink, they carry more concentrated packets of energy downward into the water column. In a bacterial-dominated ocean, the food web is fine-grained, built from tiny particles that are quickly recycled, difficult to concentrate, difficult to package into anything that a large, hungry consumer could profitably eat. In an algae-dominated ocean, the food particles are larger, the energy is denser. And for the first time in the history of the planet, the base of a food web capable of supporting something genuinely complex, something with size, with movement, with hunger, was beginning tentatively to exist. But before that world could fully arrive, the planet had one more extreme event to deliver. The snowball Earth glaciations are among the most dramatic episodes in Earth's history, and they are not metaphor. The evidence for them is real and geographically widespread. Glacial deposits found at latitudes that, at the time they were formed, sat near the equator, striations in rock left by moving ice sheets and the distinctive mixed and disordered sedimentary layers called diamictites, which form when glaciers carry and drop debris of wildly different sizes together, have been identified in ancient tropical sequences from every continent. What this evidence argues to the scientists who have spent decades studying it is that the Neoproterozoic Earth underwent 2 episodes of global glaciation of extraordinary severity. The first, the Sturtian glaciation, began around 717 million years ago and lasted until approximately 660 million years ago. The second, the Marinoan glaciation, ran from roughly 650 to 635 million years ago. Together they bracket a period of perhaps 80 million years in which the planet oscillated between extreme cold and periods of partial thawing, and during which the conditions of the boring billion were shattered, perhaps irreversibly. What caused these glaciations is still discussed, but the leading ideas involve a set of feedback loops that once started became very difficult to stop. Ice reflects sunlight, property called albedo, and the more of Earth's surface is covered in ice, the more sunlight bounces back into space rather than warming the surface, which causes more cooling, which causes more ice. This feedback can, in principle, run away. In the Neoproterozoic, there may have been enough of a trigger, perhaps the breakup of the supercontinent Rodinia, releasing fresh rock to weather and draw down carbon dioxide, reducing the greenhouse effect, to push the system past the threshold at which the ice albedo feedback took over. Once that happened, the ice could spread quickly toward the tropics, and the covering of the tropical ocean surface with ice would have dramatically reduced the rate of evaporation, reducing rainfall, reducing the delivery of silicate minerals from land to ocean, slowing the natural weathering reactions that normally regulate carbon dioxide levels. And so the trap closed, the planet froze. The surface of the ocean, at least in much of its extent, became a vast white sheet, and the sky above it was a clear, dry, bitterly cold void through which the sun shone but could do little. What life there was would have been pressed into whatever refugia remained. Around volcanic vents, in pockets of liquid water, in thin brine films beneath ice, in the ice itself, organisms survived. The evidence suggests life did not go extinct, that the microbial world found its way through, as it had found its way through so many things across the preceding billions of years. But the world during the Sturtian and Marinoan was as close to lifeless at the surface as Earth had been since its earliest days. And then the ice melted. The melting came because volcanic outgassing, carbon dioxide seeping from the interior of the Earth through volcanic activity, which never entirely stops even when the surface is sealed under ice, had nowhere to go. In a normal world, carbon dioxide is drawn back down into rock through the weathering of silicates, a process that requires liquid water and exposed mineral surfaces. Under the ice, that process was suppressed. So carbon dioxide built up over millions of years in the atmosphere, doing nothing, going nowhere, accumulating in a sky above a frozen world until the greenhouse effect grew strong enough to overwhelm even the albedo of a globally iced planet. And when the threshold was crossed and the warming began, it was rapid. The ice retreated, the oceans returned to liquid form, and the weathering machinery restarted with a violence because there was now an enormous reservoir of atmospheric carbon dioxide driving chemical attack on exposed rock, and an enormous amount of exposed rock that had been locked under glaciers and was now suddenly accessible. And here is where the phosphorus enters the story again. Glaciers grind rock. This is one of the things they do as they move. They pulverize the bedrock beneath them into fine mineral powder, sometimes called rock flour, which is among the most chemically reactive forms of rock that exists. When the snowball Earth glaciations ended and the ice retreated from what had been an almost global coverage, it left behind an enormous amount of finely ground rock exposed to the atmosphere and to the rivers that began to flow again. Weathering of this freshly exposed, finely divided rock would have released phosphorus at rates far above what the boring billion ocean had been receiving. And phosphorus, as we have traced through the long middle age of the planet, is the master nutrient, the element whose scarcity had for so long throttled the productivity of the ocean, and, with it, the oxygen output of photosynthesizing organisms. A pulse of phosphorus into the ocean after the Marinoan thaw around 635 million years ago would have been like opening a sluice gate on a system that had been starved of the very thing it needed to grow. More phosphorus meant more algal productivity. More algal productivity meant more oxygen, and more oxygen finally, persistently, meant the beginning of the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event, the second great rise of oxygen in Earth's history, the one that the first event around 2.4 to 2.2 billion years ago had promised and then failed to deliver. The oxygen levels that had stalled for over 1 billion years at perhaps 1% of present atmospheric concentrations began at last to climb, not instantly, not in any single dramatic moment, but over the tens of millions of years following the snowball thaw into the Ediacaran period and the early Cambrian, the atmosphere and the surface ocean became genuinely, sustainably oxygenated in a way they had never been before. The permission slip so long withheld was finally being written, and into this changed world, something new appeared in the fossil record, something that had no precedent in the preceding billions of years of Earth's history. Large, visible, soft-bodied, and unmistakably different from any microbial mat or stromatolite or acritarch that had come before. The Ediacaran biota are named for the Ediacara Hills of South Australia, where some of the first specimens were recognized in the 20th century. They represent organisms that lived from roughly 635 to 541 million years ago, in the period immediately following the snowball Earth glaciations and leading into the Cambrian. What they looked like is difficult to describe in any framework borrowed from the world of living animals, because many of them do not fit cleanly into any living group. Dickinsonia, among the most famous of the Ediacaran organisms, was a flat, oval, segmented form that could grow to over 1 meter in length, lying on the seafloor like a ribbed mat, apparently moving slowly, apparently absorbing nutrients through its lower surface. Whether it was an animal, a giant single-celled organism, a fungus, or something with no living relatives at all, has been debated extensively, and the discovery of fossil cholesterol in some specimens has provided at least biochemical evidence suggesting it was indeed an animal of some kind. Charnia, found originally in Charnwood Forest in England and recognized in the 1950s, is a frond-like form anchored to the seafloor, branching in a pattern unlike anything in the modern ocean. Spriggina is sometimes interpreted as an early bilaterian, a creature with a head-like end and a body with left-right symmetry, which would make it a distant ancestor or relative of the group of animals that includes almost everything with a face, including us. These organisms are often described as a first draft of complex life, and the phrase is apt in its implications. A first draft is real, and it represents genuine creative effort, and it contains within it the seeds of something that might become significant. But a first draft is also something that did not, in the end, survive intact into the finished work. Most of the Ediacaran body plans did not persist into the Cambrian. The fronds and the ribbed discs and the quilted enigmas largely disappeared from the fossil record at or near the Cambrian boundary, replaced or overwhelmed or perhaps simply succeeded by the extraordinary proliferation of animal forms that the Cambrian brought. What happened to the Ediacaran biota is another of those questions the rock record has not fully answered. Whether they were outcompeted or whether they succumbed to some environmental change, or whether they were simply an early experiment in the space of possible body plans that turned out not to lead anywhere durable, is still being worked out. But their existence is itself a profound statement. For 3 billion years, nothing like them had been there. And then they were. That is the real measure of what the second oxygenation and the snowball thaw had accomplished. And then approximately 541 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion began. The word explosion is, by geological standards, literally appropriate. Over a period of roughly 60 million years, from about 541 to 485 million years ago, the fossil record fills with representatives of nearly every major animal body plan, every major grouping of animal life that exists today, appearing for the first time in forms that are already recognizable, already differentiated, already complex. The Cambrian is not the origin of life. It is not even the origin of multicellular animals. Those had already existed in the Ediacaran, but it is the moment when the diversity of animal forms and the ecological complexity of the systems those animals inhabited crossed some threshold into a new regime that has persisted, with modifications and with the interruptions of mass extinctions, to the present day. 2 fossil deposits preserve this moment with a fidelity that continues to astonish the scientists who study them. The Burgess Shale in British Columbia in Canada was discovered in the early 20th century and is dated to approximately 508 million years ago. The extraordinary thing about the Burgess Shale is not merely the diversity of its organisms, though that diversity is remarkable, but the mode of preservation. Normally, only hard parts survive fossilization: shells, bones, teeth, mineral structures. These are what the rock record preserves, and everything soft, the muscles, the guts, the eyes, the gills, decays before the slow chemistry of fossilization can capture it. In the Burgess Shale, something unusual happened. The fine-grained mudstone of an ancient seafloor captured the soft tissues of organisms with a resolution that is almost impossible to believe. Legs, antennae, digestive tracts, eyes, gills, all preserved in 2-dimensional impressions in the grey rock of the Canadian Rockies. From these fossils we know that Cambrian animals were already extraordinarily diverse. There were filter feeders and active predators, organisms with eyes capable of forming images, creatures with legs jointed in ways we still recognize, with mouth parts evolved for capturing and processing other organisms. The Chengjiang biota in Yunnan province in China, slightly older at approximately 518 million years ago, tells a similar story and with similar fidelity of preservation. Here too are soft-bodied animals with elaborate anatomy, already living in complex ecological webs with prey and predators, with different feeding strategies, with body plans that are plainly the ancestors or close relatives of the major groups of animals alive today. Arthropods, in their ancient varieties, early chordate-like forms with hints of the notochord that in our own lineage would eventually become a backbone. Creatures without clear modern analogues, experiments in the space of body plan that the Cambrian proliferation threw out by the hundred. The Cambrian explosion is the payoff. It is what 3 billion years of geochemical weighting of bacterial patients, of oxygen stalled at 1%, of sulfidic oceans and scarce phosphorus, and singular cellular mergers. It is what all of that was building toward, though building toward implies intention, and there was none. It is, more precisely, what all of that was holding back. The Cambrian is not the story. It is what happened when the story was finally over. And now, resting in the warmth and quiet of this night, with the deep past arranged before you like a long country, seen from a great height, it is worth sitting for a moment with what you have heard. Because the Cambrian, remarkable as it is, raises a question that the science has not answered, and perhaps cannot answer with any finality. And it is the question that was implicit from the very beginning of this descent. Did it have to happen? Brandon Carter, a theoretical astrophysicist, put forward what is sometimes called the anthropic argument from timing, or what later thinkers elaborated into the framework of hard steps in the evolution of complexity. The reasoning goes like this: the Earth has been habitable for roughly 4 billion years, and it will remain habitable for perhaps another billion years before the increasing luminosity of the Sun drives temperatures too high for liquid water and complex life. Complex life arrived very late in that window. Eukaryotes did not appear in any meaningful diversity until perhaps 2 billion years ago. Animals did not appear until roughly 540 million years ago. If complex life were easy, if it were the kind of thing that happens reliably given time and liquid water, you would expect it to appear early to fill the available evolutionary space as quickly as possible. The fact that it appeared late, with only 1 billion or so years remaining in the habitable window, is at least consistent with the interpretation that it required one or more genuinely improbable steps. Steps so improbable that, given an Earth-like planet with Earth-like starting conditions, the overwhelming likelihood is that those steps do not occur within the habitable window at all. The endosymbiosis that produced the eukaryotic cell, the merger of the archaeal host with the alpha proteobacterium that became the mitochondrion, has no known second example in the history of life. Every eukaryote alive today, every plant and animal and fungus and alga descends from a single event, a single ancient merger that happened once, and apparently only once, in the roughly 4 billion years that life has existed on this planet. Whether this means the merger was intrinsically improbable, or whether it means it happened exactly as many times as the chemistry would predict, but that we simply have not found the evidence of other independent lineages that might have arisen and been outcompeted, is genuinely uncertain. But the absence of independent eukaryotic lineages is striking. And if the eukaryotic merger was a hard step, a genuinely rare event, perhaps requiring exactly the right kind of archaeon and the right kind of bacterium to come into contact under the right kind of conditions and form a stable, replicating union, rather than simply one consuming the other, then the rest of the story of complex life depended on that one event in the way that a long river depends on a single spring. Stephen Jay Gould, one of the most vivid and thoughtful voices in the history of evolutionary biology, wrote about what he called replaying the tape of life. If you could rewind the history of life on Earth to the very beginning, to the first replicating molecules in the early oceans, and press play again, would you get the same result? Would you get eukaryotes? Would you get animals? Would you get anything like the Cambrian explosion and the world that followed it? Gould argued with characteristic force that you would not, that the specific outcomes of evolution depend so heavily on historical contingencies, on which chemical happened to be present, in which concentration, on which asteroids struck, where, on which organisms happened to meet and merge and form a partnership that turned out to be extraordinarily productive, that a replayed Earth would produce something entirely different from the Earth we know, something living, probably. The chemistry of self-replication is evidently not improbable. Life appeared very early in Earth's history, within a few 100 million years of the oceans becoming stable, which suggests that the origin of simple life may be a relatively robust process, given the right starting conditions. But complex life, in Gould's reading, was not waiting at the end of an inevitable sequence. It was a lucky accident or a cascade of lucky accidents that happened to occur on this particular world. The Great Filter concept developed in the context of the Fermi paradox, the observation that the universe appears vast and old enough to have produced many technological civilizations, and yet we observe no evidence of any, draws directly on this kind of reasoning. If the universe is full of planets with liquid water and carbon chemistry, and if simple life is indeed a relatively probable outcome of those conditions, then the absence of any detectable complex life elsewhere in the observable universe might point to a filter, a step, or a series of steps through which most life-bearing planets do not pass. The eukaryotic merger is one of the strongest candidates for such a filter. The second oxygenation event, which required not only the evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis but the specific and prolonged planetary chemistry that eventually drove oxygen to levels capable of sustaining animals, is another. Neither of these filters can be confirmed from our vantage point as a civilization of one. But the length of the boring billion, the depth of the stasis, the narrowness of the coincidences, the right amount of phosphorus at the right time, the right chemistry in the right ocean, the right pair of ancient cells finding each other in the Proterozoic dark. All of it speaks to how easily things could have gone otherwise. And here, at the edge of sleep, it is worth sitting for a long moment with what otherwise would have looked like. There is a place in Western Australia, in a shallow coastal lagoon called Shark Bay, where stromatolites still grow. They are low, round, layered structures made of calcium carbonate deposited by communities of microorganisms, and they look, to an unguided eye, like irregular rocks sitting in the shallow water, encrusted and unremarkable. But they are alive. They are the living representatives of a form of life that stretches back to among the oldest structures in the fossil record, to reefs of similar layered microbial communities that were building the same kind of structures billions of years ago, when the world was young and oxygen was just beginning to accumulate, and there was nothing else of visible size anywhere on the planet. The stromatolites at Shark Bay survive today in conditions that most other organisms cannot tolerate: hypersaline water, high ultraviolet exposure, extremes of temperature, because they are the remnants of a lineage that evolved to thrive in the difficult conditions of an early Earth before the world became hospitable to creatures that would eat them. They are, in the most precise sense available to us, a window onto the world that almost stayed. The world of the boring billion, in its long middle afternoon, was a world of structures like these: bacterial mats spreading across shallow seafloors and intertidal zones, stromatolites rising slowly in the warm, shallow, evaporating seas at continental margins, cyanobacteria and their distant relatives conducting the patient, slow chemistry of a living but not complex world. No predator would have recognized that world as something worth hunting in. No eye would have formed there to observe it, no brain to hold the observation, no voice to describe it. The ocean surface, in the right conditions, might have shown a faint greenish or reddish cast from the microbial communities living in the photic zone. In shallower waters, the mats would have produced oxygen in bubbles that rose to a sky whose composition was slowly, imperceptibly changing. But there would have been no forest, no song, no movement visible at any human scale except the motion of the water itself and the occasional grinding of plate against plate deep in the crust. A planet alive and utterly, profoundly silent. This is what Earth could have remained, not through any failure, not through any catastrophe from which life was prevented from recovering. The bacteria and the archaea were succeeding. They are, in evolutionary terms, among the most successful organisms that have ever existed on this planet. They had filled every available niche. They had invented every metabolic strategy available to chemistry. They had survived everything the planet had thrown at them, from the first impact bombardments, through the great oxidation event, through the long sulfidic boring billion. They did not need to become complex. They do not need to become complex. There are more bacteria in a handful of soil today than there have ever been large animals in the history of the planet, and if every eukaryote on Earth were extinguished tomorrow, the bacteria would not notice, and the planet would continue, and the chemistry would continue, and in 1 billion years the stromatolites might still be building their quiet layered structures in the shallow seas. What made animals possible was a specific sequence of events that required specific planetary chemistry and possibly a specific cellular accident, and the fact that those events occurred in the order they did, and at the times they did, and with the outcomes they had, is not something that was written into the structure of the universe. It happened here. It happened now. It is the reason you are lying in the dark tonight, capable of thought, capable of wonder, capable of the peculiar human experience of lying still and feeling the weight of deep time pressing on the edges of awareness. There is something almost unbearably improbable about that, not in the sense that demands celebration or gratitude from any particular direction, simply in the sense that demands honest attention. The chain was long and it was fragile, and it very nearly broke at several points along the way. The oxygen that rose at 2.4 billion years ago and then stalled, the phosphorus that stayed scarce, the molybdenum locked in sulfide at the ocean margins, the singular merger that happened once and, as far as we can determine, never again. The billion years that the world held still, not from malice or error, but simply because the conditions for the next step had not yet been assembled. The ice that came twice and almost ended the experiment entirely, and then retreated and left behind the finely ground rock and the phosphorus pulse and the oxygen surge that finally allowed something more than a microbe to persist. And through all of it, the bacteria going about their work, unaware, if awareness means anything in this context, of how close the world was to never becoming anything more. Unaware that their long dominion was in some particular corner of the ocean, in some particular configuration of chemistry, being quietly superseded. That a new kind of cell was accumulating patiently in the low oxygen margins. That the eukaryotes were waiting as if for permission that the planet was only slowly, reluctantly granting. And perhaps that is the most honest version of the answer to the question this whole long night has been circling. What if complex life had never evolved at all? The answer is it almost didn't. It required the right planet in the right orbit around the right star, with the right geochemistry and the right tectonic history and the right delivery of phosphorus and the right concentration of sulfide and the right pair of ancient cells finding each other in the dark and choosing, in the chemical language of membranes and metabolites, to stay together. Every one of those conditions had to be met, and they had to be met in roughly the right sequence, and they had to hold long enough for the next step to become possible. The tape, replayed from the beginning, might not produce you, might not produce anything listening to a voice in the dark wondering about its own improbability. The tape might produce only the patient mats and the slow stromatolites, and the silent ocean shifting its chemistry in the sunlight, and a sky that gradually fills with oxygen that no organism large enough to breathe it ever arrives to use. But it didn't. And the fact that it didn't is the whole of the story you have been inhabiting tonight. Somewhere tonight, there are people at Shark Bay looking at those stromatolites in the low light, and perhaps some of them know, and perhaps some of them feel in the way that a fact sometimes translates itself suddenly and completely into feeling, that they are looking at the world that almost stayed. The world that ruled for 3 billion years and came within some narrow margin of ruling forever. And around those ancient structures, the shallow water moves with the same indifferent rhythm it has maintained across geological time, and the bacteria in the layered structure go about their ancient chemistry, and the evening is quiet. If this slow journey into deep time is the kind of company that helps you towards sleep, there are more stories here of the same careful and unhurried kind, waiting for whenever you want them. And if you feel moved to share where in the world you are listening from tonight, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and I read them. There is something right about knowing where in the world someone is lying in the dark, thinking about how improbable it is to exist at all. You have done enough for one night. The boring billion has ended, the ice has come and gone, the algae have risen, and the oxygen has climbed, and the first strange animals have pressed their soft bodies into the Ediacaran mud and been preserved there for us to find. The Cambrian has opened like a door through which everything that came after, every shell and spine and eye and brain and thought, has walked. And you are here, at the far end of that long chain, in the quiet dark, with the weight of 4 billion years pressing gently, gently down. Let the deep thoughts settle, and let yourself sink with them.